Hi, my name is David Fraser. I'm a privacy, internet, and technology lawyer with the Canadian law firm McGuinness Cooper. In April 2022, the Minister of Canadian Heritage tabled Bill C-18, the Online News Act, in Parliament. It's worked its way through the House of Commons and the Senate. It may have been one of the most debated and discussed bills that I can think of. The Commons Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage devoted around 14 meetings to its study, and a Senate committee devoted about 10 meetings to the task. It was passed by Parliament on June 22nd of this year and immediately received royal assent. Unless repealed, it comes into effect no later than the third week in December 2023. I think it's one of the worst examples of bad public policy in the technology space alongside the Online Streaming Act. It essentially uses pretend market and bargaining mechanisms to legally extort money from successful tech companies to prop up failing legacy news businesses. In the process, it throws digital-first journalists under the bus. Before I get into the meat of this, I should be 100% clear. I think that a healthy and vibrant news industry is essential to our society and our democracy. I think it should be supported financially. Now, it should be from the public purse and not by selecting a group of successful companies and saying, we don't like them, so we'll raid their coffers. This sets a horrible precedent. And now we have draft regulations that the government fancifully thinks will fix this abomination of a law. They're simply wrong. I have a longer, more detailed discussion of the Online News Act, which I'll link below. Today's talk is about the Act now that we have the draft regulations to discuss. You know, it always was a dumpster fire, but now we have a better idea of what the dumpster fire will look like. In a nutshell, the Online News Act is a reaction to the loss of revenue experienced by traditional news media. They used to sell subscriptions, but mostly they sold ads in order to pay for the production of news. At the same time, but not really related, you have an internet advertising ecosystem that has emerged and that is doing very well. So you have shrinking wallets on one hand and growing wallets on the other. The legacy media think that the money that used to go into their wallets is now going into the online advertising industry wallets, and they want a piece of it. So they convinced the government to come up with a scheme to transfer loads of that money into the wallets of the traditional news media. In a nutshell, here's how it's supposed to work. There are two principal categories of entities that have a direct interest in this process. You have news outlets on one hand, and then you have digital news intermediaries on the other. To be a news outlet, you have to produce news content. Each of them are defined. So it says news outlet means an undertaking or a distinct part of an undertaking whose primary purpose is to produce news content and includes an Indigenous news outlet or an official language minority community news outlet. And then it says news content means content in any format, including an audio or audiovisual format, that reports on, investigates, or explains current issues or events of public interest, and includes such content as an Indigenous news outlet makes available by means of Indigenous storytelling. So news outlets are supposed to be at the receiving end of this cash fire hose. The cash comes from the digital news intermediaries. Here's a definition. Digital news intermediary means an online communications platform, including a search engine or social media service that is subject to the legislative authority of Parliament and that makes news content produced by news outlets available to persons in Canada. It does not include an online communications platform that is a messaging service, the primary purpose of which is to allow persons to communicate with each other privately. Through this whole process, the government made it clear that they intended that Google and Meta, the owner of Facebook, were the two digital news intermediaries who would be required to pay the news outlets for carrying links to news content. You'll note that it says, subject to the legislative authority of Parliament. I'm not sure that any search engines or social media sites are subject to the direct legislative authority of Parliament in the way that is ordinarily understood in Canadian law. They're not a railroad and they're not an airline, but I'll have to leave that for another day. The government says that the bill is to ensure fair revenue sharing between digital platforms and news outlets. Fair revenue sharing? Revenue from what? Revenue for what? What they're bargaining for really has nothing to do with the underlying issue. The media get much more of a benefit from having their links shared by the platforms than the platforms get from hosting those links. Most of the online links to news that I click on are put there for free by the media outlets themselves. The media can control whether their sites are indexed by Google, and most of them include specific tools to encourage you to share their story by social media. If that costs the media, then they wouldn't put the links there. So what is being paid for? There's no copyright or any other sort of property in links. Even the snippets are fair dealing. The government is simply making up a new legal regime to fund news media on the backs of big companies. And that's easier to do because these two companies are not Canadian companies. And this sets a horrible precedent of having successful, innovative businesses subsidize the businesses that have been eclipsed by progress. Will solar panel makers have to subsidize oil companies at some point? So what does it do? Essentially, it requires the digital news intermediaries to negotiate with the media to compensate them for something they're really not entitled to compensation for in the first place. But if sufficient qualifying agreements are not negotiated, there's a cumbersome process of arbitration that will impose a payment schedule on them. And it's all overseen by the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission. Meta has clearly said in the meantime that it will not be worthwhile for them to be a digital news intermediary, so they've stopped hosting links on their platforms. Google has said that they're looking at it and may follow suit. So what do the regulations do? Well, principally they do two things. It sets the floor on who is a digital news intermediary and sets a ceiling on how much cash they have to shovel at news outlets to become exempt from further mandatory cash shoveling. In order to deal with who is a digital news intermediary who is subject to the Act, it defines what is a significant bargaining power imbalance from Section 6 in the Act. And it does that based on revenue and visitors. The DNI has to have $1 billion in annual revenue from all sources, almost all of which has nothing to do with making news available. And they have to have 20 million Canadian visitors per month if they're a search engine, or 20 million active monthly users if they're a social media site. So that's Meta and Google. It's interesting that Microsoft, operator of the Bing search engine, has more than $1 billion in revenue, and so did Twitter, at least before it was acquired and went private. Interestingly, Postmedia had about $500 million in revenue last year. Let's also remember that in order to be a DNI, you have to make news available by links. If you don't do that, you're not a digital news intermediary. And that's what Meta has chosen to do, or more accurately, has chosen not to do. So that's the floor, which is pretty low. So what's the maximum liability for a digital news intermediary who decides to play the game? It's essentially 4% of the company's Canadian revenue from all sources. That number is inferred from taking the company's global revenue, multiplying it by the Canadian share of global GDP, and then multiplying that by 4%. The Canadian press did the math and said that it would see Google pay $172 million and Meta pay $62 million to Canadian news outlets. Essentially, they have to pay a tax of 4% to carry links to the news. This is a link tax. I think you would have to be completely deranged to imagine that Meta gets $62 million in revenue or benefits from carrying links in Canada. The same can be said for Google. So even with this ceiling of contributions, I think it's certifiably insane. In the regs, compensation can be cash or non-cash, but calculating compensation according to the draft regulations, it completely discounts the benefit that the media get from being featured for free on social media and in search. While these are the main headlines related to the draft regulations, there are some other things in here. When the news outlets sidle up to the trough, they don't need to put all the money in journalism. Not even half of it. Just some. The rest can go to, executive bonuses or stock buybacks. The voluntary agreements are supposed to cover a range of news outlets, local, Indigenous, official language minority, generally be within 20% of each other, and protect editorial independence. Now, Meta says they're not going to play this game. They're out. Google is apparently considering following the same or a similar path. This would be funny if it wasn't so tragic. There's a whole generation of digital-first news creators who rely on links hosted by Meta and Google. They're getting thrown under the bus based on an ill-conceived law, and the government is currently doubling down on it. The new Minister of Canadian Heritage was quoted as saying that the draft regulations make it fit for a decade. Quote, "We know how technology evolves or how the market changes sometimes at a rapid pace, and we want to make sure that this bill is relevant in 5 and 10 years. This is absolutely tragic for journalism in Canada. That idiocy is tragic for journalism. If Meta and Google exit the Canadian news market, it will be devastating for those digital-first innovators in the news market. It will have a huge impact on Canadians' ability to find and share information. If you take the time to read the criticism levied against this initiative, you'll see that the government had many options to facilitate support for the media sector, but has taken this irresponsible and reckless path. These regulations do nothing to fix it. The big platforms are as likely as ever to choose to comply with the Online News Act by stopping to facilitate access to news in Canada. I've seen some suggestions that Instagram may somehow be hived off from Facebook so that Instagram can still be used for news sharing. I don't see how that would work in the legislation or the regulations. If anyone is listening, I think that this whole thing should be scrapped and a new scheme should be established to provide public funding for quality news in Canada. There's already a Canadian journalism labour tax credit with an independent advisory board on eligibility for journalism tax measures. This should be expanded to cover not just employees, but also freelancers. It should also be expanded to cover other non-labour expenses associated with creating quality journalism. If journalism is a public good and it's hurting, it should be publicly funded. We should not set a precedent where failed business models are propped up by those who are successful. And the money that's supposed to go to journalism should go to journalism, not executive bonuses or stock buybacks. It should be noted that these are proposed regulations and anyone is able to comment on them. I'll leave a link below so you can have your voice heard. I hope this has been interesting and useful. I try to put out a new video each week or so. So if you're interested in this sort of content, please click the like and subscribe buttons. Also leave a comment if you have any questions or if you have any suggestions for other topics to cover. And of course, feel free to share this with anyone who you think may be interested in hearing about developments in Canadian tech and privacy law. Thanks for tuning in.